Welcome back to Fandom Frontline, everybody. Tonight we're talking about Alien Earth, the first TV series in the Alien and Predator franchise, and one of the boldest entries in modern sci-fi horror I've really ever seen. The finale aired last night, and I have a lot of thoughts. This live stream is called Where Our Humanity Ends, Survival Begins, because I think that's what the heart of the show really was trying to discuss. So I'm going to go through the show's big themes, Wendy's evolution as the central figure of the series, the Lost Boys and Boy Cavalier, corporate horror, and of course last night's finale, The Real Monsters. I'll also be pulling in your thoughts from the chat, so if you're here live, sound off. I want to hear what worked for you guys, what didn't, where you think season 2 might be heading. It is interesting to point out that in the poll about everyone's favorite new creature in the show that I posted to promote this stream, every single person who voted chose the plant as their favorite new creature. For whatever that's worth. I personally really enjoyed the plants as well. When we didn't really see it do anything for the first 7 episodes, I knew it had to have something fun in store for us in the finale, and it sure did. So let's start broad. Alien Earth isn't just another monster show. It's not just about xenomorphs hunting people in space corridors. It's about corporate evils, arrogance, and what happens when we play God with both biology and technology. Think about the opening episodes. We weren't just immediately thrown into nonstop alien attacks. Instead, Noah Hawley took his time showing us Prodigy Corporation, introducing us to Wendy, and showing us how these Lost Boy hybrids were manufactured. This was essentially Alien as an extended fable, a fable about exploitation, human weakness, and systems collapsing under their own hubris. It's more in the lineage of the original Alien and Aliens, but it does have some of that slow burn dread of Alien 3 and the philosophy of Prometheus. Right away, I do want to ask the chat, did you like that slower, more philosophical approach, or were you hoping for wall to wall alien carnage? And be honest, I do know some people really would just want the chestburster and facehugger violence, and I can't say I entirely disagree. I was expecting even more of that in the finale, but I'm also not disappointed by what we got. So let's talk about Wendy, played brilliantly by Sydney Chandler. For me, she was the heart of the season. She's not Ripley, she's definitely not David, she's truly something in between, a hybrid, a question mark. Her relationship with the xenomorphs is fascinating. She fights one, but then she connects with them. She summons them. Now, I know some people might find that to be problematic for this franchise, maybe a little blasphemous, but I find it interesting, and just because she's able to do it now doesn't mean it will last for the entire series, so I will reserve judgment. After all, they're definitely glad to eat actual humans and do plenty of violence there, so that's really all that matters. We've never really seen them going after androids and whatnot previously anyway. So in the finale, when Wendy makes those noises and the alien shows up on cue, it was kind of one of the coolest shots in the whole season. And it wasn't just spectacle either. She also represents the show's central question: what makes someone human? Is it biology? Is it memory? Is it choice? And do we think Wendy will still remain sympathetic if there's more seasons, or is she crossing into something alien herself? Now, The Lost Boys. What a brilliant twist on the Peter Pan idea. Kids in adult bodies being treated like the floor models in a corporate showroom. That moment in the finale where they reclaim their names, like Jane and Arush, that was powerful. Identity became rebellion. It's not just about fighting Cavalier or Weyland-Yutani, it's about saying we're people, not products. And it's also classic alien storytelling. Think about it. In Aliens, Ripley bonds with Newts. In Alien 3, she bonds with prisoners who are considered expendable. The franchise has always been about the disposable fighting back. So, which Lost Boy stood out to you guys the most? Did you connect with Jane or Isaac, or was there any that you didn't feel get enough screen time? Now I'm going to turn to Boy Cavalier. The actor Samuel Blanken gave us one of the creepiest corporate villains in this entire franchise, almost on par with Weyland-Yutani themselves. That monologue where he talks about building his first synth to replace his alcoholic father, that explained everything about him. He's both genius and tyrant, child and abuser. And when he sneers "Sweeties, your floor models," that was brutal. He represents the cold, exploitative side of corporate science, just like Weyland-Yutani does. To him, these hybrids are just test runs, toys to break. I kept thinking about Ash in the original Alien or the Weylands in Alien vs. Predator and Prometheus. Every installment of this franchise gives us a face for corporate cruelty, and Cavalier might be one of those personal versions of that yet. The abused child turned abusive father figure in the form of a tech CEO. Where does he rate for you guys among alien villains? Would you consider him top tier or forgettable? In any case, let's not ignore the actual horror, because this show delivers some truly wild body horror moments. Arthur's chestburster scene, heartbreaking because Arthur was one of the only thoroughly kind souls on this show. Now, that scene wasn't just gore, it was tragedy. They made us actually care about Arthur, and that was really why this show worked. There was also the Eye, Teocellus. Now tell me that wasn't the weirdest, most creative new creature this franchise has given us in years. It was creepy, funny, and unforgettable. There were also smaller moments, like in the finale when that crab was crawling in Arthur's chest cavity and standing up to a xenomorph. That's right out of the dark comedy tradition of this whole genre. So, question for you guys: what was the scariest or most memorable creature moment of the season? Was it the chest burster, the eye? Was it Wendy summoning her pet xenomorph? In any case, let's talk the finale, the real monsters. Maybe it was a little thin or felt rushed at times, but as a statement piece, I really felt that the finale worked in pulling everything together. Wendy leading the hybrids to cage their creators, standing in the center with aliens on either side declaring, "Now we rule," that was chilling. It's not a happy ending or a tragic ending, it's a cycle. The exploited become the rulers, new monsters inherit the earth, and now we're left asking if the cycle can be broken. And I think that's really the key to Noah Hawley's vision here. Looking ahead to season 2, I have to wonder, will Wendy lead a new civilization? We know where this franchise ends up in 2 years when the Nostromo launches. It's not necessarily looking good for the Lost Boys. Will Weyland-Yutani strike back harder? We know that they're going to be the dominant corporate entity on Earth, so what could that mean for Prodigy? What happens when the Xenomorphs themselves realize they don't need Wendy to lead them? What do you guys want to see in season 2? I will say that Noah Hawley did have some interesting comments to make in an interview with Variety, and I have it pulled up here. So before I get into your questions, I am going to read some of that as well. He was asked by Variety that it's clear that Wendy's come into her own, and that the Variety interviewer was really struck by the way Joe looked at her almost afraid during the sequence. Was wondering if that's a sign that Wendy is embracing her hybrid side more and moving away from her humanity. And Noah Hawley asked, that is the central question of the series, right? Is Wendy going to choose human or other? There's a push pull between her brother, who represents on some level the best of humanity, and the Kirsh or Boy Cavalier sense of why settle for human when there's so much more potential out there. So her brother is realizing that whatever big brother pull he had is really gone at this point. The problem with letting children have all that power is that their executive function isn't great, and their sense of consequences isn't necessarily fully developed. There's a hubris there. As she says, maybe this xenomorph could be good, right? But those of us who know what xenomorphs are like, well, maybe it can be controlled for a period of time. After all, we've seen xenomorphs make friends with each other, but we've also seen them tear each other apart when they need to as well. So Holly said it was worrisome. She has all this power, but she doesn't yet have the perspective he thinks that Joe thinks she needs. And then Variety did ask him, would it allowing Wendy to communicate with and control the xenomorph open up for you in the writing process? And Holly said it obviously gives her a very powerful sidekick, as we see in the last couple episodes, but also the moment she releases the creature, it kills a bunch of people and she's not watching. She isn't facing the consequences of the decision. And there's a real moral conundrum that she's going to face if part of her power is causing the injury or death of human beings. Then where's her moral high ground? For Holly, violence, which is so inevitable on Fargo and on Alien, he never wants violence to just be entertainment. He wants it to be impactful and meaningful, and to confront the audience with their desire for it. Those moments are where we're trained as an audience to feel like violence is the only way to resolve a conflict. But let's look at that a little more closely and see how we feel about it. Then Variety asked him about the fight between Morrow and Kirsch, which was both exciting in the sense that we're seeing what it looks like when a cyborg and a synthetic fight, and is also thematically rich. It's altered man versus machine. And so Holly said the moment he wrote the elevator scene, he knew that you had to pay it off on some level. You don't want to make people wait for the second season. The hubris of Morrow's statement, man will always win, it's a question of will. Then 25 seconds later, he's getting choked out by a machine. It's like, don't count the villain out, right? Freddy Krueger never dies, as Holly puts it. That battle, on some level, is a fight between heroes and villains, right? And Holly would love to take the poll of the audience and say, who do you want to win this fight? Because Holly doesn't know for sure. It's like when you see Captain America fight Iron Man and you're like, I don't know what I'm rooting for. Neither one of them can die. You don't want that to happen. But who's right? It becomes a question of whether you believe in authority or whether you believe in rebellion. And speaking of authority, that leads to Variety's next question for Holly, which was all of the show's authority figures, quote unquote, Morrow, Kirsch, Boy Cavalier, Dame Sylvia, they're in a cage in the end of the season with a xenomorph looming above them, looking potentially ready to pounce. They asked, will any of them be taken off the board in a potential season 2? And if they're staying, how will this shape their journeys? And then Holly said to that, what we've seen throughout history is don't count the villains out, right? The worst thing you can do is humiliate them and hand them a defeat because it makes them more dangerous in the long run. There's always a moment in which somebody humiliates the villain and now all the love in him is gone. So then Variety asked, did Kirsch's perspective on the Prodigy project shift over the season, or we were just gradually given more insight into how he had always felt about it? And Holly said there's a moment when Kirsch says to Hermit's character, "How do I take care?" When he asked, "How do I take care of my sister?" And Kirsch responds, "That's like an onion asking, how do I take care of a star?" That's his perspective on human beings. And so if you think that Kirsch was created by humans and works for humans, and in many ways is programmed with some prime directives not to harm them and cause them to be harmed, yet deep down inside knows he's superior to all of them, that's kind of a recipe for a personality disorder. Think of all the people you know who are like, "I'm smarter than everybody else." You're like, you do not have a happy life ahead of you. So I don't think it's much of an evolution of his, but more since he was put in charge of these creatures and has been conducting these experiments. And you begin to realize that maybe the experiments also involve the hybrids and the humans, and there's a larger permission that Kirsch was given. And so, of course, Variety's favorite, just like so many people's favorite, was the alien eyeball. He had to ask about it entering Arthur's body. And Holly said when we first met the creature, it was inside an obviously dead cat, so we know it can reanimate a body. There's something symbolic about it. If Arthur was the moral center of the show, perhaps the best of humanity, who died because of the worst qualities of humanity, now he's not even allowed to rest in peace, there's a sort of final corruption that happens in a pet cemetery way. To take the thing that you love and bring it back as something other can really be the most disconcerting for an audience. And so then Variety asked something that I'd been wondering myself. They asked, understanding that the timeline of the show takes place 16 years after Alien Covenant, they're struck by the fact that its events take place so shortly before the original 1979 Alien. In a potential season 2, does Holly think that it'll get closer to that timeline and integrate it? And Holly said, "I think there are bridges that you cross right when you come to them. A big part of the world building and the act of creation on these first 8 episodes was to build something that was coherent to itself, that worked within the construct of the movies, the first 2 movies in particular. In success, in a season 2 and beyond, then we really need to dig down and start to think about how these two stories are going to cohere together in the long term. And that doesn't mean Holly doesn't have thoughts about it or hasn't had thoughts about it, but in terms of the planning, part of why Holly is successful in this business is that he knows which problems he needs to solve today and which problems he needs to solve tomorrow, and he doesn't worry about tomorrow's problems until tomorrow. They're exciting problems. You realize 50 years later that you were only looking at half of the puzzle, and now he gets to build the other half of the puzzle to conform to the pieces of the original. He likes a challenge like that. He wouldn't take on this kind of IP like the Alien and Predator franchise if he didn't, on some level, think the constraints made for innovation. And then Variety asked him if he's working on writing season 2 right now, and then Holly said, no, it's conversational at this point. You learn to be efficient and don't work ahead of yourself. There's conversations that are going on. Obviously, the show's about to wrap, and we'll get a really complete sense of what the viewership was, and I would imagine that decision would follow soon after as to whether to do a second season. Obviously, none of us, Disney or myself, want a single day longer than necessary to get a second season on the air in success. Everyone wants to get the decision right, but we also want to be ready to go. Holly certainly knows where he's going. The moment they fire the starting gun, he's out of the block. And then the last thing Variety asked him was about all those 90s metal songs at the end of every episode. Apparently, they loved it as much as I did, because I really did. And they asked him, what's going on with that music choice week after week? And Holly said he's got a lot of quippy ways to talk about it, classic movie, classic rock, but at the end of the day, Holly made an arena show. They didn't make the Paramount Theater show, they made the Shea Stadium show. And he wanted to end with that level of emotion that comes from Metallica or Jane's Addiction or Pearl Jam. You want the big feeling. And those songs, I see you, Alien fans, and I know what you listen to because I listen to it too, right? There's nothing more rock and roll than an Alien movie. And so that was Noah Hawley's interview, and there was a lot of interesting stuff in there, especially the knowing that he hasn't really written the details of season 2 or anything that may or may not come after it, but he definitely does want a second season, and that to me that's the important thing. It really was obvious that what we saw was a cliffhanger, not an ending. There's still more story to be told to close the gap between Alien Earth and the original Alien. And there's a lot of story that can be told in 8 episode seasons in just in 2 years of storytelling. Now, with that done, I do have some other questions here that I can answer for the chat, so let's get into those before I take anything from the live chat. One person asked, what makes a great season finale to me? Is it about closure, setup for the future, or perfect balance of both? And how does that apply to Alien Earth? Well, I don't ever want there to be too much closure in a season finale if there's going to be more seasons. I think Star Trek Strange New Worlds is actually a really good recent example of that, where season 3 ended on a much more definitive note, even though it's getting 2 more seasons. And similarly, if this were the final episode of Alien Earth for good, that would feel really anticlimactic, right? It would feel like we were left with a lot of ambiguity in what happens between the show and the original movie. So I do think a perfect balance for both is the right answer, but it also depends on what you're doing. Obviously, a series finale should have complete closure. You never want to see a series end with any sort of cliffhanger or too open ended necessarily. So let's get to the next question. Someone asked, "What scares me more in horror, the monster itself, or what humans do to each other when things fall apart?" Funny enough, I'm actually never scared by movies or shows. I think it's why I enjoy horror so much. But I do have to agree, the more real human evils are, that can be the scariest for me. But maybe a better way to put it is not scary, but rather depressing. Let's see. The next question is, when a show is part of a big franchise like Alien, do I prefer it to connect heavily with films or carve out its own identity? Hmm. I think I personally prefer heavy connections. I think carving out its own identity is a good thing when you're going to have multiple shows. Maybe not if it's going to be the only show. For example, if they never do another Alien TV show, then one would hope that the only Alien TV show really feels like watching Alien. But if they were going to do five TV shows, then it would be really cool if they were all different sorts of things in their own way, sort of like Marvel is doing. Never, not, all the shows are kind of a little bit different, even though there's a little bit of a house style. It never feels like you're watching the exact same thing all the time, and for good reason. The next question was, how important are strong side characters to the enjoyment of a season? Do they matter as much as the leads? Well, I would say that all the characters in Alien Earth were certainly strong, major and minor. For what little screen time she had, I'm very curious what they're going to do with Miss Yutani as a villain. As far as I know, we haven't seen any Weylands after Peter Weyland, played by Guy Pearce, passed away in Prometheus. So I'm pretty sure the Utanis are actually in full control of the company at this point, which in a way does make them the big bads of the Alien franchise in a way, though not ones that will ever be defeated, unfortunately. Um. Oh, here's a good question. I was asked if I value atmosphere more in horror storytelling or plot twists. It depends on the horror story, I guess. I mean, atmosphere is always important, otherwise it's hardly even horror, but I don't know. I don't think plot twists are really what define the horror genre anyway, but not that I'll say no to a good one. Well, let's see. Then I got asked what has more staying power, horror on the big screen or long form horror on TV. And I would say we've really only recently started to get some great horror on TV over the past like 15 years or so. What has more staying power? I don't know. You look back at the great classic horror films, and those have stayed for so long, but I think we're really witnessing something new with some of the great horror shows these days, and I think it would be irresponsible to try to answer this when really long form horror on TV is almost kind of a new animal in a lot of ways. Then someone asked if Wendy was still sympathetic at the end of the season or had crossed over to becoming the villain. I don't think she's become the villain, but she's certainly put herself in a place where she could, and maybe she'll have a tragic downfall. And I guess the thing about that that's really heartbreaking is that she is still a child. And you never want to see children having these necessarily horribly heartbreaking tragic downfalls. It was bad enough when Isaac died, but we'll see. Maybe she will go from being hero to villain protagonist. Guess we'll find out. Then I was asked which Lost Boy had the most compelling arc and why, and I think that's easily Wendy, just because they developed her the most. Although everything they did with Slightly was actually, or I should say, Arush at this point. Everything they did with that character was pretty interesting as well. That was especially heartbreaking because he really felt trapped. At no point does he ever set out to be a villain or know who he could ask for help. And honestly, he's kind of surrounded by villains, so like, who do you trust at that point? Moro was just as scary as anyone working for Prodigy, so. And then I was asked, oh, how did I feel about the new creatures introduced this season? The eye, the ticks, the flies, the plant. Did they fit the franchise or feel too weird? That's a good one. I loved all of them. I especially love the eye, Teocellus. I really hope they do more with that. Clearly, that the eye does have motivations. It is not just, it's clearly just trying to survive first and foremost, and the more intelligent of a creature it can find to occupy, the better. It doesn't look like it necessarily actively wishes harm for the sake of wishing harm, nor is it afraid to do harm. It will kill whoever it has to live in the long term. It plays chess, not checkers, is probably a better way to put that. Or I should say she, as it was once called, but, the eye. Anyway, oh, here's a good question. What moment hit me the hardest emotionally, like Arthur's chestburster death or Morrow's backstory, or Joe and Wendy coming to argue about humanity? And honestly, even though Morrow is kind of an evil corporate stooge for Weyland-Yutani at this point, his backstory was really sad. And I was also sad to see Arthur go as well because, he was genuinely a sweet character who I don't know how he ever ended up where he is, working for these awful, awful people. Sometimes when you have that kind of intelligence, maybe the smartest thing to do is just not to use it for evil or let it be used for other people's evil ends, I should say. I do think there was a certain level of ignorance that the Sylvias had to have in thinking that Prodigy was just trying to help people with what they were developing. Here's a question. Do I think Noah Hawley leans too heavily into dialogue and philosophy, or did it balance out the horror and action? And I will say flat out, I'm glad there was a lot of depth and dialogue to the show. I'm glad it wasn't just a bloodbath. Other shows can do that, and that's fine, but Alien has always been hard sci fi, asking the big questions. You even watch the original movie. It's a sci-fi horror film first, and it's a lot more of that than just violence. Even though you might remember the chestburster scene the most, but the evil corporate masterminds are really what sit with you. Here's a question. Was the finale's ending, Wendy declaring now we rule, satisfying to me, or did it need a bigger set piece? Mm, I will say that I was expecting more of a set piece than we got, but I'm not necessarily disappointed by what we got as long as it eventually leads to a great overall finale. Especially knowing that however the show ends will be leading into the original Alien. Or maybe it'll go beyond the original Alien. I don't even know. We don't even know that's not necessarily the case either. I mean, they could have that movie take place in between seasons. Then I'm asked if season two happens, should the show stay on Neverland or move to a larger world stage? I almost feel like if you're gonna keep doing the show for long, you have to leave the island some more at some point, especially with the name of the show being Alien Earth. However, I feel like the public can't become entirely aware of the xenomorphs either, so they're kind of in a box. Because, going into all the Alien sequels, no one's seen a xenomorph. No one knows what those are. Corporate cover up, obviously, but, it's not like they can make it to a populated area and no one would know about it. So I guess should the show stand Neverlands? Not entirely necessarily, but will it stand Neverland? Probably mostly. Then another question. Do I believe Alien Earth has the potential to be the best installment of the franchise outside of the original two movies? Why or why not? Okay, for only saying the original two, while I wouldn't necessarily say it's my favorite, because I actually really liked Ridley Scott's prequels, I would say I could definitely see a lot of people having this be their favorite aside from the original two. For me, not necessarily, but I think there's a perfectly reasonable argument to be made for calling it the best Alien alongside the original two movies, depending on what your taste is. And I certainly wouldn't in any way judge you if that was your choice because this is a great show. Oh, and then the last question, of course, what do I think is in store for us in Predator Badlands in November since that's next in the franchise? Well, we already know that the synths in Badlands have the Weyland-Yutani logo on their eyes. The director did say there's not going to be any xenomorphs in the show, but that doesn't mean there won't be connections. And I almost wonder if they're eventually planning to do another Alien versus Predator story of some kind. Honestly, it would be great if Alien Earth's next season really tied into that as well. And that's it for questions. So to wrap up, I felt like Alien Earth was ambitious, occasionally messy, but ultimately brilliant. Not to mention it had those great end credit songs too, and I loved those. So at its best, Alien Earth captured exactly what made this franchise endure, not just the fear of the creature in the dark, but the recognition that humans will always be the real monsters. So thank you all for hanging out with me for this deep dive, and don't forget, I'll be back with more reviews of the Alien and Predator franchise, The Walking Dead, DC, Marvel, and of course, Predator Badlands is only a month and a half away, so expect my review after that.